Hey nerds, what's up? So Amazon Prime's Wheel of Time got canceled. That's right, season 3 will be the last season and there will be no more. Deadline reported today, or well, by the time you're seeing this, yesterday, that the Wheel of Time got canceled for financial reasons. The article reports that while season 1 was a high performer for Amazon Prime, season 3 really dropped in viewership according to the Nielsen's charts. And overall, that the performance of season 3 was just not strong enough compared to the show's cost, so Prime didn't feel like they could commit to another season. So I found this out just a few hours ago and I thought I want to talk about it, mostly because there has been a lot of things about fantasy TV and fantasy adaptations that have been floating around in my head for several months, and I just didn't have a good enough reason to talk about them. So today I'm going to use the Wheel of Time as a jumping off point to talk about other things in fantasy TV, such as, are the fans always right when it comes to adaptations, how making TV has changed in terms of how often we get TV and how much it costs to produce, and then finally, how we just know very little about the performance of TV because we don't get a lot of TV data. So let's jump right in. Are the fans always right? I think the answer is, it's complicated. Several times now in various videos, I have said that adaptations aren't made for the fans, and I always get a ton of pushback when I say that. People do not like hearing that, and I get it. The idea that an adaptation of your favorite thing isn't made for you is a tough pill to swallow as a book lover. But we can look at some data. Now, as always, anytime I put statistical data up here, I need to talk about its limitations. Both of these things I'm going to talk about were based on surveys, and as always with surveys, there is a bias because it is self-reported. So let's talk about that. Also, I'm going to use a couple different studies, which means that the method of collection wasn't the same, so you can't always compare one to one. This kind of data is really hard to come by, but I think this is still illustrative. I'm also focusing on data in the United States because it was very easy for me to find. A government survey was conducted through the National Endowment for the Arts, and they did it based on the census in 2022. And according to them, 48.5% of Americans read any book for pleasure within a calendar year. So it only had to be one book, and they asked surveyors to omit any reading they did for work or school. So this was reading a book for pleasure. So a little under half of the population read at least a single book. So it could just be one in 12 months. Now, I wanted to compare that to how many people watch a TV show in a given year. And the data doesn't exist because apparently that's not a question that anyone thinks they need to ask, because I guess it is so obvious to everybody that everybody watches TV apparently. Apparently the number is just assumed to be 100%. Instead, all the data we find for people who watch TV in the last 12 months usually looks about hours, how much time per day you are watching. So I looked at an American Time use survey from 2022, so at least it was the same year as my other data. It was also a questionnaire, even though it had a different population, and it said the average person watched 2.8 hours of TV per day, and that TV made up about half of all leisure time on average. If we're measuring books read by at least one per year, and we're measuring TV usage in America by hours per day, I do not think it is a huge jump for me to say that many, many more people will watch a TV show than will read a book. And I think we can continue to extrapolate to the conclusion that when a book adaptation of any type does extremely well and becomes really famous and beloved, that a majority of those viewers are not readers. They have watched the show or movie and haven't read the book that it's based on. That's conjecture, but I feel pretty good about saying it. Honestly, that's why adaptations are often so important for authors, because it brings their ideas to a much, much bigger audience and a generally much more lucrative audience. And in fact, I think a lot of our most famous book series are usually bolstered because they have an adaptation that was well received and in the zeitgeist. Even think of like Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, which is obviously a classic novel, and it wasn't going to be like ever in obscurity. It's one of the most famous novels of all time, but there is zero denying that many, many people's only experience with Pride and Prejudice is either the 1995 BBC or the 2005 Keira Knightley. There has been a lot of adaptations, but those ones are super in the zeitgeist and keeping Pride and Prejudice alive for new generations. even if the book is great. And it's a common tale among many adaptations. All this to say, if an adaptation is successful to the general public, it probably doesn't really matter what fans think. Now, on the other hand, if we are making an adaptation from a book, it is likely that that book did very well and was popular and well-liked. And so if you take that property and you are making it because it is well-liked, isn't the next logical conclusion that you should probably try to mostly faithfully adapt it because there's a reason people fell in love with the source material to begin with? All this to say, when I look at successful adaptation, it seems to be this careful balance of very widely and popularly accepted among the general public, and that most fans generally view it favorably. I would never say all fans, but most fans view it favorably. Wheel of Time is one of those things that was really tough to get a beat on because it's so dependent on what circles you were in. In some corners of the fandom and some corners of the internet, I found the response to the show to be overwhelmingly positive, where I'd visit another corner of the fandom and all of a sudden it was wildly negative. In one hand, the show could do no wrong and everything was explained away. In the other hand, the show could do no right, and even things that a lot of people thought were good were railed upon as not being nice. It was very contentious. I will just say, it made the Wheel of Time fandom incredibly contentious, and that's probably a sign within itself. I don't always think fans actually know what would make a good adaptation. I think the written word and visual media is incredibly different, and things that can work in either one of them simply don't work in the other. And I've had a whole video talking about that, so I don't need to belabor the point here. Sometimes it's one of those things is you just don't know it till you see it. I think a lot of the times the way we report on fantasy TV already starts us off bad because fans will latch on to an article saying this is going to be different and immediately like that's going to be bad without giving it a chance to breathe. It's why even though some of the early stage changes in Wheel of Time Season 1 gave me pause, if you watch my videos on it, I wait until the end of Season 1 to really make a statement about it because I wanted to try to meet the show on its ground because the mediums are so different. And so I just think it's very reductive to say, well, if they just followed the book exactly, then it would be right. If fans liked it, it's for us, it's for the fans. Because I just don't think either of those are necessarily true. And I'm bringing that up in terms of Wheel of Time because I just know that's where the conversation is going to settle around. It was canceled because the fans didn't like it. It was canceled because they didn't remain faithful to the source material. And while I think there is truth, shades of truth in those statements, I just don't think they tell the whole story. Really, one of the biggest problems of the fantasy TV landscape is just the changes in TV, which is that it's taking way longer between seasons. We are getting way less episodes, usually 8 for fantasy TV, and they're often dumping all of the episodes at once, which makes the waits between seasons feel even longer because you're not getting like 8 weeks of it stretched out. I think this is particularly damaging for fantasy, which tends to have a higher level of complexity, more made-up names and terms and locations that fans have to keep track of, generally more characters. I'm not saying non-fantasy shows don't have large casts, but generally the books tend to have large casts, a lot of magic, and a lot of complicated storylines. So waiting years between seasons is much more difficult to keep people interested and game and keep momentum going. Now, there's various reasons I found as I've researched this for why TV has gone to this model of tons of time between episodes and lesser episodes. And a lot of it is about it starting in COVID, because obviously COVID restrictions created a bunch of problems. And then when we were coming out of COVID, we had a writer's strike, which also obviously created problems. However, now that those things are kind of like mostly in the past, we're still here. It's more like it might be an excuse to keep things this way. Of course, one of the other reasons is people complain about how much more expensive it has become to produce TV. Part of that, I think, started in COVID because of the restrictions and the way they had to adapt cost money. But I also just think our budgets have gotten out of control for TV, particularly fantasy TV. Could we spend less money? Could we go back to slightly cheesier TV that looks a little less polished and a little less good, and instead give me more episodes or give me more time? I know that's easy to say standing here, but I like a decent amount of cheesy TV shows. It's not like Merlin. was that stellar in terms of the CGI department. I actually kind of studied this a little bit in a previous video where I did a regression analysis on budget versus reception for fantasy movies, mostly because data on TV shows isn't as readily available, and found that it really didn't make much a difference. I feel like recently budget has become a pride factor. I remember how often Rings of Power's budget was advertised as if that was the thing that made a good TV show. Did we need $465 million for Rings of Power season 1? Actually, some people say with the rights it was like close to $1 billion. No, I don't think so. In fairness, Wheel of Time and Game of Thrones had similar budgets when you account for things like inflation and working at that high of a budget where a couple $1 million here and there probably doesn't matter. And Games of Thrones was wildly successful and Wheel of Time season 1 was fine. But overall, if cost of producing is one of the issues, how do we keep costs lower? And is it just less time making stellar effects? And would that really proportionally damage viewership? That's, I guess, my question that I can't answer, but I have a feeling in my heart that what we would gain from more episodes and faster release time would negate what we lost from super polished things. One quote I found interesting when looking up the reasons for a longer distance between seasons was this. Speaking this week, Pope said the gaps are getting longer because broadcasters and the streaming industry are now too data-driven, and this means they have to wait longer to make the big calls. She believes that buyers are biding their time before deciding on a recommission because of the growing focus on metrics in an on-demand world, in which the bulk of the viewing takes place in the weeks and months after the launch, wrote Farber. This comes up where I just really wish they'd greenlight multiple seasons of a fantasy TV show in the beginning. I recognize that's really expensive and I have no experience as a higher up, so maybe that is impossible now. But imagine if they had greenlit 2 seasons of Wheel of Time where you know you are going to come back and maybe get a stronger through line of those seasons. It also has to save a little bit of money season to season because you could do some bulk filming, especially with your actors. Feels like it would be better. Imagine if they had greenlit 3 seasons right away, where you're not always scrambling or changing things in between seasons. It's a risk. It's definitely a risk, but I, again, wonder if that risk could pay off. And last but not least, I just wish they gave us 10 times more data about TV. For whatever reason, it's really easy to find movie data. Actually, I think I know. It's because they will publish how much they spent on movie data, and then you go to a theater and buy a ticket, and they will publish how much money that movie made via ticket sales. So it's pretty easy to compare budget to what you made as a general sense of success. Much, much easier. With TV shows, I know as we've moved to streaming, I know these streamers must have the data. Amazon could tell me how many people watched The Wheel of Time season 1. What percentage of viewers watched through episode 8 of season 1, of season 2? I think it's called completion percentage. What was the drop off between the seasons? How much actually did each season cost to produce, and how much did Amazon make off of the streaming of that? And how do they calculate how much they make off of it? When the way streaming works is very different than traditional movie ticket sales. The problem is they just literally never give you this data. And that sucks. I wish we knew. What did it look like for The Wheel of Time, and what does it look like for shows they consider wildly successful, and what's the gap there? I've seen guesses based on Nielsen data and things like that, but nothing from the companies themselves. So it feels like we'll never really know, and our perceptions of the success or not success of a TV show often just depends on the demographics of those around us. You know, as someone who is online and has a following who was invested in Wheel of Time, it was so interesting, some of the conversations I had with people where I'd say, well, everyone in my inbox and all of my friends in real life that I am texting about Wheel of Time dislike this storyline the most. But then in my comment section, people are saying, among all my friends, that storyline that all your friends hate is all of their favorites. They say it's the one they're the most invested in. So our perception of that storyline is going to be vastly different. Apparently on our demographic. Is it our age difference? Is it our viewing habit difference? Is it our reading difference? Is it the way people I make friends with versus the people you make friends with? Because we don't have data overall, I feel like my perception of how successful or not successful something is doing is just almost sometimes based on the fandom with which I'm in, unless it is like universally praised, a la the One Piece live action adaptation, where only like on my video that got a ton of views did I finally get fans being like, I didn't like it. But overall, the conversation anywhere I was in was overwhelmingly positive. So ultimately, Wheel of Time being canceled. And somehow, I guess I'm not surprised. I'm surprised because I did think it was by far the best season and not even close creatively. However, one thing is that when I started texting my friends or posting about the Wheel of Time on my Instagram, because I did little in the dark reviews, nobody knew season 3 had started, including me. Someone had to be like, oh, are you watching the season 3 episode 1 tonight? And I said, excuse me? It's starting? I didn't know. Amazon didn't tell me. When I logged into Amazon, there was nothing. I didn't get a single Amazon box. I'm comparing this to season 1 where it was like so heavily advertised. According to Amazon, I have watched seasons 1 and 2 several times because I had to clip pull so much for my videos. So you would think they'd be like, guess what? Season 3 is out. Here it is. And based on my other friends and followers on Instagram who are easier to message me more, all said very similar things. Like, I was watching the Wheel of Time regularly and I had no idea it was coming. Why did they advertise it so much less? And would that have made a difference if they had advertised it heavily? That would also be a more cost, so did it not feel worth it? I am curious about that. I don't know, maybe it didn't matter. Overall, I am sad the Wheel of Time got canceled. As I said in the beginning, I thought it was actually going somewhere. But I can't say, I guess, as I contemplate on it, that I'm overly surprised because it feels like that is where a lot of fantasy TV is going. Unless it makes a huge splash immediately. So, tell me what you think about a more casual vid. This was very casual for me. I usually plan a lot more, but decided to get on and just kind of talk. Tell me if you hated it. Tell me if you like me to cover some more in the moment, like newsworthy things, since I am known to cover things long after they are relevant, because I just usually take some time to think. Let me know. Let me know what you think about the Wheel of Time being canceled and any of the stuff I talked about in terms of fantasy TV. I'd love to know your thoughts. And as always, if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye. Care. This is the first season that I would actually be incredibly bummed if it did not get renewed. And I hate knowing that it hasn't been renewed yet because I actually want and am eager to see season 4 because they keep improving so much. I imagine that season 4 could be extremely strong.